David had always prided himself on being a patient man, someone who took the time to observe and understand the people around him, especially Charlotte. They had been married for 12 years, and while the spark from their early days had dimmed over time, they had always had a solid understanding of each other. But recently something had shifted. Charlotte had become distant, her late nights more frequent, and her smiles felt strained, like she was hiding something. David noticed the subtle changes, the way she looked at her phone when she thought he wasn't watching, or how she would rush off to take calls in another room, always leaving him in the dark. He never said anything at first. He wasn't the type of man to jump to conclusions without concrete evidence. But the feeling that something wasn't right had settled deep in his chest, gnawing at him whenever he was alone, eating away at the foundation of trust he had built over the years. The signs had been there, small but persistent. Charlotte, the woman who once couldn't wait to share her day with him, had begun to retreat into herself. It wasn't like her. And yet David resisted the urge to confront her, holding on to a thread of hope that he was simply overthinking it. He had seen relationships crumble in front of his eyes, and he was determined not to let paranoia ruin the life he had with Charlotte. It was on a Wednesday evening, a quiet night like any other, that the discovery came by accident. David was cleaning out a drawer in the living room, looking for a missing receipt, when his hand brushed against a small leather-bound book. It was Charlotte's diary, the one she had kept since she was a teenager. He had never been one to pry, never felt the need to invade her privacy, but something about the way it had been carelessly left out, sitting there, half-hidden behind some old receipts, struck him. He had seen that diary before, tucked away in the back of her nightstand, locked away behind a barrier of privacy. Curiosity gnawed at him, but David fought the urge to open it. He knew that once he read what was inside, there would be no turning back. The truth would be laid bare, and he would have to face whatever secrets Charlotte had been hiding. But the temptation was too strong. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he opened the first page. It was only a few words, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Charlotte's words, her thoughts. David's heart began to race as he turned the pages, feeling the weight of each sentence sink in deeper. What he read next shattered everything. The affair, the lies, the betrayal. Charlotte's words spilled from the pages, confirming what his gut had been telling him for weeks. Each sentence, each confession, pierced David like a blade. There was no mistaking it. His wife had been living a secret life, and now there was no turning back. The days that followed the discovery of Charlotte's diary were a blur for David. His mind was constantly churning with thoughts, piecing together the fragments of his life that had never quite made sense until now. The woman he had loved, the one who had been his partner through thick and thin, seemed like a stranger to him in those quiet moments of reflection. He had always considered himself a perceptive man, one who could read people with startling accuracy. Yet how had he missed the signs? How had he been so blind to Charlotte's deceit? David's quiet nature had always been his strength, but now it felt like a weakness. He was used to being the steady one, the calm in the storm, but that composure had started to crack under the weight of his discovery. He had always prided himself on not jumping to conclusions, on not letting his emotions take control, but this was different. Charlotte's betrayal cut deeper than he had anticipated, and the more he reflected on it, the more the pieces fell into place. The late nights were the first clue. Charlotte had always been a hard-working woman, and while her career in design had required long hours in the past, recently she had been coming home later and later, sometimes not until well past midnight. David remembered how she would insist that it was just work, that she was busy with deadlines or meetings, but the excuses had started to sound hollow. He had been understanding at first, telling himself that she had a lot on her plate, but over time it became harder to ignore the unease that had settled in his chest. David had also noticed the way she had been behaving with her phone. It wasn't just that she kept it close to her at all times, or the way she would smile a little too quickly when he caught her looking at it. It was the secrecy. Charlotte, who had once left her phone carelessly lying on the kitchen counter without a second thought, now guarded it as though it were a lifeline. The familiar sense of openness that had existed between them was slowly eroding, replaced by an invisible wall that David could not breach. And yet he said nothing. His instincts told him that confronting her would only push her further away, so he held back, watching and waiting for the right moment to confront the truth. Then there were the small things, the little lies that slipped out of Charlotte's mouth during casual conversations. David had always trusted her, never questioning her word, but now those moments seemed laden with hidden meaning. Charlotte would mention a lunch date with a friend, only for David to later find out that the person she had been with was not a friend at all, or the time she had spoken of meeting a client, only for David to find that the client's name did not exist in her work schedule. These were small discrepancies easily explained away by anyone with a passing knowledge of the nuances of daily life. But David's gut told him that these inconsistencies were more than just coincidence. They were signs, flashing in front of him like warning lights. As the days wore on, David found himself replaying every interaction with Charlotte in his mind, searching for answers in the smallest of details. He thought back to their last vacation, how Charlotte had seemed distant, lost in thought, even as they lounged on the beach. She had always been the one to plan their trips, to make the most of their time together, but this time, something was off. She had seemed distracted, as though her mind was elsewhere, and David had dismissed it as exhaustion from work. He now realized that there had been more to it, that her body may have been with him, but her heart and mind were already somewhere else. And then there was the way she spoke about her day. David had always asked her about her work, genuinely interested in the projects she was working on, but lately, Charlotte had become vague, providing only surface-level details. She would talk about meetings in passing, but when David pressed for more information, she would quickly change the subject or offer an excuse to leave the room. It wasn't that she was hiding anything, at least not in the traditional sense, but there was a noticeable shift in the way she communicated with him. What had once been open and easy conversation had become an exchange of polite pleasantries, as though she was no longer invested in their shared life. David began to wonder if he had missed something all along, if there had been signs from the very beginning that he had overlooked. He questioned his own judgment, wondering if his trust in Charlotte had clouded his perception. After all, he had never been the type to doubt, to question his partner's loyalty. But now, with the painful truth staring him in the face, he could see how easy it had been for Charlotte to deceive him, how well she had hidden her affair behind layers of excuses and half-truths. The more David thought about it, the more he realized how much of their life together had been a facade. He had been living in a bubble of comfort, lulled into a sense of security by the routine of their marriage. But that bubble had burst, and now David was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer made sense. Each new realization felt like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless with the weight of it all. And yet, there was no denying the truth anymore. Charlotte had betrayed him, and there was no way to go back to the way things were. The days following David's discovery of Charlotte's affair were a whirlwind of emotions, each one more intense than the last. He felt betrayed, shattered, and oddly numb, as if the world around him had suddenly lost its color. The weight of Charlotte's betrayal was a crushing burden, yet it came with a sense of clarity. For the first time in weeks, months even, David no longer had to guess at what was happening between them. The truth was there, written in her own hand, every word a confirmation of the fears that had been festering in his mind for so long. Each day since the discovery, David had kept to his routine. He went to work, he ate dinner, and he even slept, though the hours were fractured and restless. Charlotte, for her part, seemed oblivious to the emotional hurricane brewing in David's mind. She had returned to her usual self, or at least the version of herself she had been before the diary had been discovered. She smiled at him in passing, kissed him on the cheek as she left for work, and made small talk during the evenings, but David couldn't look at her the same way anymore. Every word she spoke, every glance she cast, felt like an empty echo of the woman he had once known. It wasn't the way Charlotte had behaved that bothered David. It was the realization that she had been living a lie, that everything he had trusted about her was now called into question. For years, they had been a team. They had built a life together, invested in each other's dreams, and shared their hopes for the future. How could she have so easily cast all that aside? How had she been able to compartmentalize her feelings, to live two lives without any regard for the person who had been by her side all these years? The affair, as detailed in Charlotte's diary, wasn't a brief lapse in judgment. It was an ongoing relationship, one that had spanned months, maybe even longer. David read her words over and over, unable to tear himself away from the cruel truth that she had not only lied to him, but had also justified her actions, in a way that left him reeling. Charlotte had spoken of her lover with a strange mixture of longing and regret, but what struck David the hardest was how little guilt she seemed to have about the damage she had caused. She had been consumed by the excitement of the affair, caught up in the thrill of deception, all the while knowing how deeply it would hurt him when he eventually found out. The betrayal cut deeper because David had never once suspected that Charlotte was capable of something like this. They had built their relationship on trust, and for years he had relied on her honesty, her openness. Charlotte had always been the more outgoing of the two, the one who wore her heart on her sleeve, and David had trusted her implicitly. Now, reading the pages of her diary, he saw how carefully she had concealed her true feelings, how she had hidden her affair beneath layers of false affection. What made it worse was how Charlotte had written about him in those pages. She spoke of their marriage as if it were a burden, a duty she had fulfilled out of obligation. There were no words of love, no tender moments shared between them. In the diary, David was portrayed as the dutiful husband who provided for her, but who, in her eyes, had become predictable, unexciting, and unworthy of her affection. He was simply a means to an end, someone who gave her the stability and comfort she needed while she sought passion elsewhere. As David read, the tears came, not out of anger or frustration, but out of a profound sadness that he couldn't shake. He had believed in their life together, had believed that the foundation they had built was unbreakable, but now, everything felt fragile, like a house of cards, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. He had always been the one to stay calm in situations of conflict, but this was different. This was personal. This was the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, the person who had once been his everything, and she had shattered that bond with a series of lies and deceit. But what hurt most wasn't just the affair itself. It was how Charlotte had continued to live as if nothing had changed. She had gone about her days as if she were still the loving wife, the caring partner, and David had been none the wiser. She had been playing a game, pretending everything was fine, and all the while David had been blind to the cracks forming beneath the surface. After hours of reading and rereading the diary, David knew what he had to do. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no going back. He had spent so long questioning himself, wondering if he was imagining things, but now, with the evidence staring him in the face, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Charlotte had betrayed him in the most personal way possible. She had broken their marriage, their trust, and now it was up to him to decide what came next. The first step was confronting her, but David knew that he couldn't do it in the heat of emotion. He needed to remain calm, to take control of the situation. He couldn't let her manipulation or charm sway him any longer. She had to face the consequences of her actions. The diary had given him the truth, and now he was going to use it as the weapon it had become. When the time came, he would confront Charlotte with the evidence, with her own words, and he would demand the answers he deserved. There would be no more games. There would be no more pretending that everything was fine. The truth would come out, and with it, the inevitable fracture of their marriage. David's mind was made up. The confrontation was coming, and he was ready to face the woman he had once trusted, the woman who had now become a stranger to him. The day of the confrontation arrived with a heavy stillness, a sense of inevitability hanging in the air, like the calm before a storm. David had spent the morning steeling himself for this moment, carefully organizing his thoughts, making sure he had every detail of Charlotte's betrayal in mind. He had never been one to lose his composure easily, but this was different. His hands shook as he poured himself a cup of coffee, his mind replaying the countless moments of their life together, now stained with the harsh reality of her infidelity. The house was quiet when Charlotte came downstairs, her usual morning routine of fixing breakfast and checking her phone unfolding as it always had. She moved with a grace that David once found comforting, but now it seemed like a dance he was no longer a part of. She greeted him with a smile that felt hollow to him now, as though she was playing a role she no longer believed in. "Good morning, love," she said, her voice light, almost too light, as she kissed him on the cheek. It was the kind of kiss that once carried warmth, but now felt like a gesture more out of habit than genuine affection. David didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He had been preparing for this moment for days, yet now that it was here, he felt strangely calm. The anger he had expected to feel was absent, replaced by a quiet resolve. He had known for a while that this moment was coming, but seeing Charlotte's face, so oblivious to what he knew, made his heart ache in ways he hadn't expected. When she began to prepare her breakfast, David stood up and walked toward the drawer where Charlotte's diary still lay, its contents now permanently etched in his mind. With a deep breath, he took the book in his hands and carried it to the table. He sat down across from Charlotte, who was still humming as she cracked eggs into the frying pan. "Charlotte, we need to talk," David said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight of finality. She stopped mid-action, her eyes flicking to his face, a faint furrow appearing between her brows. "What about?" she asked, her tone almost too casual, as though she hadn't been anticipating this moment. David opened the diary, carefully turning the pages until he found the entries he needed. "About this," he said, placing the open book in front of her. "I've been reading this, Charlotte, and I think it's time you tell me the truth." The color drained from Charlotte's face as her gaze dropped to the pages before her. The air between them thickened, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. David watched as her fingers trembled, her hands hovering over the words that had once been her secret, her confession. Charlotte opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced up at David, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and panic, before she quickly looked back down at the diary as if willing it to disappear. She swallowed hard, her throat constricting, but David could see the guilt written all over her face now. It was a look he had never thought he would see, especially not in his wife. "This is what you've been doing, isn't it?" David continued, his voice calm but carrying an edge of pain. "You've been seeing someone else behind my back, lying to me, living a double life, all while pretending everything was fine." Charlotte shook her head, but the denial was weak, a hollow attempt to protect herself. "David, I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she began, her voice faltering as she looked at him, trying to read his expression. "I trusted you," David said quietly, the hurt in his voice palpable. "We built a life together, Charlotte. I believed in you. I never questioned you. And this," he motioned to the diary, the evidence of her affair, "this is what you've been doing behind my back." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, but David could see the manipulation in them. She had cried before, had used tears to soften his heart, to make him forgive her when she had wronged him. But this time it wasn't going to work. He wasn't going to be fooled again. I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered, her voice trembling as she finally looked up at him. "I was confused. I never meant to hurt you, David. I just wanted something for myself." David's heart sank at her words. The selfishness in them was a cold slap to his face. "So what? Our life together wasn't enough for you?" he asked, his voice a little louder now, though still controlled. "You couldn't have just talked to me, Charlotte? We've always worked through things together, but instead you chose to cheat. You chose to lie." Charlotte's lips trembled as she tried to form an explanation, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat. She had no excuse that could justify what she had done, no defense that would make him understand. The affair had been her choice, her decision, and now it was all crashing down around her. David watched her, his heart heavy with a mixture of sadness and disbelief. He had loved her, had trusted her with everything he had, but now, as he sat across from her, all of that love felt like a distant memory, a dream that had been shattered by the truth. "You had an affair, Charlotte. And now you're asking me to forgive you?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but the pain in it was unmistakable. For a long moment, Charlotte said nothing. The silence stretched out between them, both of them trapped in a web of their own making. Finally, she stood, taking a shaky breath. "I never meant to hurt you," she said again, but this time her voice was weaker, as though she had lost the strength to fight for the life she had tried to hold on to. David didn't say anything in response. He just stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. "I think we both know what needs to happen next." As Charlotte stared at him, her face a mixture of guilt and regret, David took a long, steady breath. He knew that their marriage was over, and though the road ahead would be painful, it was the only path forward. The days that followed the confrontation felt like they dragged on forever. David wasn't sure what he expected after that moment, but he knew it would never be the same. The silence between him and Charlotte was deafening. They no longer spoke of the small, inconsequential things that once filled the space between them, the casual conversations over breakfast, the fleeting touches as they passed each other, the easy rhythm of their days. Everything was gone. What was left was a cold, empty house, where the air was thick with unresolved emotions and the remnants of a broken trust. David had moved into a guest room, not because Charlotte had asked him to, but because he couldn't stand the thought of sleeping in the same bed, next to a woman who had shattered everything he had ever known about their relationship. It was strange to lie there, staring at the ceiling, and not feel the warmth of her beside him. The emptiness in the bed mirrored the emptiness inside him. He no longer knew who Charlotte was, and worse, he no longer knew who he was in relation to her. The man who had once believed in their love and the strength of their bond was now someone else entirely. That trust had been ripped away from him, leaving a gaping hole. In the days that followed, Charlotte didn't push him to talk. It was as if she, too, knew that words had run out. She spent her time in the living room staring at the walls or burying herself in work, pretending to maintain some semblance of normalcy. David could see the guilt in her eyes whenever their paths crossed. The same eyes that had once been filled with love and affection now held a mixture of regret and fear, as if she realized the magnitude of what she had done. But even that wasn't enough to make David want to return to the woman she had once been. The person he had shared a life with was no longer there. She was a stranger, someone who had deceived him, who had lied and betrayed him in ways he couldn't begin to understand. David knew he had to make decisions. The house, their life together, their future, everything had to be reevaluated. There was no going back to the way things were, and the idea of trying to rebuild after such a breach of trust felt impossible. How could he look at her the same way? How could he pretend that everything would be okay after the betrayal had been exposed so clearly? It was not just the affair that had torn them apart, but the lies, the manipulation, and the years of deceit that had built up behind the facade of their marriage. One evening, David came home from work to find Charlotte sitting in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she stirred a cup of tea. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation in days, and as soon as he stepped into the room, she looked up at him, her eyes full of hesitation. "David," she started, her voice breaking slightly as she tried to find the right words. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." David didn't reply immediately. Instead, he walked past her, his mind reeling with the weight of her words. The apology felt hollow to him, a feeble attempt to make amends for something that could never be fixed. He sat down at the table across from her, the distance between them now more than just physical, it was emotional. "I know you're sorry," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "But it doesn't change what you did. It doesn't change the fact that you lied, that you betrayed me." Charlotte's lip trembled as she stared down at the table. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with the tears she was trying to hold back. "I can't fix this. I know I can't. But I need you to know that it wasn't about you. It was about me. About something I lost inside myself, and I didn't know how to find my way back. I thought this affair would fill that emptiness, but now I see how wrong I was." David sat in silence, the weight of her confession pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what to say. The words felt meaningless now, like they were just an attempt to soothe a wound that could never fully heal. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Charlotte," he said, the raw honesty of his words cutting through the quiet of the room. "You've taken something from me, something I can't get back." Charlotte nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She had no defense, no justification for what she had done. She could only sit there, feeling the full weight of the consequences of her actions. For David, the hardest part was not the anger, but the deep, gnawing sense of loss. He had lost the woman he had loved, the woman who had once been his partner, his confidant. And with that loss came a profound sense of isolation. No matter how much Charlotte apologized, or how many tears she shed, it didn't change the fact that the trust they had built over the years had been destroyed. The foundation of their marriage had crumbled, and David was left standing in the ruins, unsure of how to rebuild, or even if he could. The days turned into weeks, and the reality of their situation began to set in. David knew that he couldn't live in limbo forever. He had to make a choice. The idea of continuing their marriage, of trying to make it work after everything that had happened, felt impossible. He wasn't sure if he could ever see Charlotte the same way again, or if he could ever trust her. But what he did know was that he couldn't keep living in a house where everything reminded him of her betrayal. Eventually, David made the decision to leave. He didn't want to be around for the hollow promises and empty apologies anymore. It wasn't about vengeance or anger, but about reclaiming his own life. He needed space to heal, to rediscover who he was outside of the man who had been deceived. It was time to let go of the past and start a new chapter, one that was free of the weight of betrayal. As he packed his things and walked out of the house for the last time, David felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. He had loved Charlotte with everything he had, but now he was walking away from that love, leaving behind a chapter that could never be rewritten. The road ahead would be uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, David felt a flicker of hope. He was free to start over,